It's now nearly 12 weeks since Suzy Lamplugh left her estate agent's office to meet a client and never returned. Perhaps the unusual nature of the crime, perhaps the fact that 25-year-old Suzy was such an attractive, outgoing girl, kept the press constantly interested in her case. In fact, the stories about what happened to Suzy are so many and varied that the facts have become somewhat obscured by rumour and gossip. The reconstruction you're about to see is based entirely on what is known, on police evidence and eyewitness reports. It begins in Putney, southwest London, on the morning of the day Suzy disappeared. Monday, the 28th of July. Susanna was getting up in her flat in Disraeli Road in Putney.
In the news, the Queen's private secretary has rejected claims by the Sunday Times that there have been differences between the palace and the Prime Minister over Mrs Thatcher's policies. In a letter to this morning's Times, he says the Queen's press secretary Michael Shea did speak to the...
Suzy shared her flat with a lodger, Nick Bryant.
Hi, Suzy, I'm off.
Oh, hi, you're up early. Would you like a cup of tea before you go?
I can't. I've got an 8:30 meeting this morning. You going to be in tonight?
Yeah, I expect so. I'll see you later. Oh, by the way, have you left the ironing board up?
Yes, it's in the sitting room.
Great. Okay, see you tonight. Bye.
Have a nice day.
Just after 8:30, Suzy set off for work in her company car. It was only a 10-minute drive from home to her office in the Fulham Road.
Hello, this is Susanna Lamplugh from Sturgis in Fulham. Did you receive our details that we sent through to you? Oh, good. Did you see anything?
Susanna had worked for Sturgis estate agents as a negotiator for just over a year.
It's a two-bedroom house.
Her job involved taking on new clients and showing them round properties. Sometimes she'd have as many as 6 houses to show in a day.
Okay.
On this Monday, she left the office at 20 to 1, and as was often the case, she told no one where she was going or when she'd be back. As well as her own keys and purse, she took with her property details and keys for a house in Shorrold Road, number 37. Exactly what happened after Suzy left her office isn't clear. There's no doubt she went to Shorrold Road, but in fact there are 3 streets in Fulham which provide vital sightings. In Shorrold Road, 3 witnesses saw Susanna outside number 37. The first witness was on his way home. He saw Suzy standing in the gateway. She seemed to be waiting for someone. 10 minutes after that, the owner of the house next door heard someone leaving number 37. That brief glimpse led to this artist's impression. At about the same time, Nicholas Doyle was on his way to the nearby North End Road market. Doyle remembers the man was carrying a bottle of champagne with ribbons on it. From his description, police later produced this identikit picture of the man. But strangely, Suzy's car was never seen in Shorrold Road. A number of people did see it a mile away in Stevenage Road. It's a 5-minute drive from Sturgis, and it was exactly 5 minutes after she'd left the office that the first sighting came. At 12:45, as Wendy Jones was leaving home to go shopping, she noticed the white Ford Fiesta parked immediately opposite her house. Just before 2, a taxi driver who lived close by also noticed the car. By 3:30, Wendy Jones was back, and the car was still in exactly the same place, slightly overlapping the entrance to a neighbour's garage. Then, at 5:15, the garage owner, Richard Mann, saw it too. Other witnesses remember the car in the same position. It seems it was there all afternoon. But in a third street in Fulham, there's conflicting evidence. A sighting of Suzy and her car. The Fulham Palace Road is about half a mile from Stevenage Road. At about 2:45, Barbara Whitfield, a friend of Susanna's, was cycling to a business appointment. She has no doubt she saw Suzy driving towards her. She waved, but Suzy was talking to her passenger and didn't see her.
I'm sure it was Suzy, because I knew her very well. At the time, I was convinced it was her car as well, although it conceivably could be one that was just similar. They're quite common. I didn't get a chance to look at him, because she was turned towards him. And anyway, I was concentrating on her rather than him.
By 3:30 that afternoon, Sturgis manager Mark Gurdon and his staff were becoming concerned by Susanna's absence. In her desk diary, they noticed an appointment for 12:45.
To start off with, I personally went round to 37 Shorrold Road to see if she perhaps got herself locked in or something like that. After there was no joy there, we phoned round between us, loaded the local hospitals to see if she'd been involved in an accident with her car or anything like that. We continued to do that actually for a few hours because obviously she could have gone to Putney or where she lived, so we checked with those hospitals. Finally, before actually officially reporting her missing to the police, we phoned her mother just to check to see if she'd gone home. She hadn't gone there. And obviously by that stage we were very concerned and phoned at about 5:30 to the police to report her officially missing.
Be on the lookout for a white Ford Fiesta, registration mark B Bravo 396 G Golf A Alpha N November. It's concerned an abduction from...
At 9 o'clock, police began a street search for Suzy's car. It was still parked in the same place in Stevenage Road.
Fulham receiving.
Go ahead.
I found this white Ford Fiesta, B Bravo 396 Golf Alpha November in Stevenage Road. Can you inform the CID, please?
The driver's door was unlocked and inside was her purse, but neither her own keys nor the keys to 37 Shorrold Road have yet been found. The driving seat was pushed back from Suzy's normal driving position. This picture was taken on Saturday night, just 2 days before she disappeared. Suzy Lamplugh has now been missing for 81 days. Well, Detective Superintendent Carter, one of the strangest things is that, as we can see from the map, she parked her car in Stevenage Road and yet she was going to an appointment in Shorrold Road. Why do you think that was?
That is right. It takes exactly 5 minutes from where she parked her car on Stevenage Road to Shorrold Road. And we know that she arrived there, or the car was definitely seen at 12:45.
What about the sighting of her, the third sighting at about 2:45 by a friend of hers in the Fulham Palace Road? How do you account for that?
Well, Miss Whitfield is the only witness throughout this inquiry who actually knows, so of course her sighting has to be taken very seriously.
It's a complete mystery. It was the last time she was seen alive, too.
That is the last time, yes.
What about the keys to 37 Shorrold Road and the property details? They've never been found, have they?
No, when she left the company, she took keys to the property of number 37 on this distinctive yellow fob. We still haven't found that.
So perhaps somebody might have seen that. Could we have your description again of the man that Mr Doyle saw? I gather you're much happier with the description you got from him than perhaps the one that got more publicity of Mr Kipper earlier on.
Yes, we're looking for a type. I'm asking the people to look for a type. He's aged 25 to 30. He has a dark complexion and we believe probably a broken nose. He has dark hair which is swept back and he was immaculately dressed in a charcoal dark suit.
Do you think Suzy knew him?
Well, the fact that the car was at Stevenage and Shorrold's she was seen later indicates that she probably did know him, yes.
Now, the other important thing is that a couple were seen arguing fiercely in that area, weren't they, by a man who hailed a taxi cab later on?
Yes, between 2 and 2:30, a taxi was hailed by a man who has a full beard and moustache. And he told the taxi driver he'd just witnessed a couple having an argument. Now, I'm appealing to that man to come forward And of course, I would like to eliminate the couple who, in fact, were having the argument.
He might have vital information, mightn't he?
He could well have vital information, yes.
Now, this case has had so much publicity, as I said earlier on. A lot of people have come forward to help. There's been a lot of rumour and gossip, really. What do you think that tonight's reconstruction might achieve that all this publicity hasn't so far?
Well, it's nearly 12 weeks since Suzy disappeared. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that someone, somewhere out there knows and can help us. And I do earnestly appeal for that person to come forward.
We just need that one call. Mr Carter, thank you very much. Do please call us if you have anything that might help. It's 01 811 8055 here to the studio, 01 811 8055. Or you can call the inquiry headquarters, and that is 01 741 6212. That's London 741 6212, and ask for the incident room.
Now to television's answer to the wanted poster.
Few cases have attracted as much intrigue as the mysterious disappearance of the 25-year-old estate agent Suzy Lamplugh from Fulham in London in 1986. Decades on, and 2 investigations later, we are still left puzzled as to what actually happened to this young woman.
This is a young lady who disappears from a London street in the middle of a sunny July day and is never seen again. There is no trace of her anywhere, and that is quite extraordinary.
She wouldn't just have disappeared without telling anyone.
The search for Suzy quickly escalated into one of the largest investigations in British criminal history.
I have not experienced a similar case to Suzy Lamplugh. The inquiry will stick in the minds of every police officer that was originally involved.
She literally disappeared off the face of the earth. It fascinated people in one way, but equally it horrified people.
Years later, the theories about what happened to Suzy Lamplugh are rife, making this a crime that shook Britain. Hertfordshire, England. July the 28th, 1986. The brother of Suzy Lamplugh received a telephone call that will change his life.
I was working at a fish farm. I remember when my dad, I think, phoned me and said that Suzy has not returned from a time when she was showing someone around a house, and they were starting to get worried.
Richard's younger sister had worked for Sturgis estate agents in Fulham, London, for just over a year.
It was just before my mum's birthday, and it was just not a sort of thing that she would have done. It was really worrying.
Gradually, information started to feed back to Richard and his family about the circumstances. When colleagues looked into her schedule, they noticed an entry by Suzy to show a client around an empty house at 12:45 p.m.
We had a missing estate agent, which wasn't all that suspicious until we found out that where she'd gone to with Mr Kipper within Sturgis estate agent. Nobody really knew who he was. He wasn't a regular customer, and it rang bells that night.
There's an oblique reference, I think, to Mr Kipper viewing Shorrold Road in the diary.
None of Suzy's colleagues knew of the name in her diary or had any details for him.
Well, we didn't have any clues at all, to be honest. Mr Kipper was somebody nobody had ever heard of. It was just a name in a diary for an appointment with Suzy.
As the afternoon wore on, colleagues grew more concerned for her whereabouts.
She never returned to Sturgis estate agent that afternoon, and she never went home to her mother's house that afternoon. Although she did live in a flat of her own, nobody'd seen her since about midday that day.
You think, well, she'll probably turn up. And she didn't, you know, you know, you didn't know what happened to her. You thought, well, maybe she's had an accident, maybe she's lost her memory, maybe, you know, something's gone, you know, and you do sort of, everything goes through your mind about what happens.
As the police learned more about the circumstances surrounding Suzy's disappearance, they drafted in extra officers and began a meticulous search of the local area.
That night, we stepped up what would have been a normal missing person to a very high-risk missing person inquiry. We went to Suzy's flat in Putney. I went to the front door. We didn't have a key, unfortunately, so I had to force the door open with my shoulders. There was nothing in the flat that made me suspicious that anything untoward or suspicious had happened in the flat. No sign of any struggle or blood or anything untoward.
Although the flat didn't shed any light on her whereabouts, the team did receive some disturbing news.
On our way back to Fulham Police Station, we heard that they'd found Suzy's car down in Stevenage Road, which was about 1.5 miles away from Shorrold Road.
On further inspection, Suzy's car appeared to have been abandoned.
The company car she used to ferry clients to view various properties in her role as an estate agent was found unlocked close to Bishop's Park and Fulham Football Ground.
The car wasn't parked properly. The car was parked overlapping somebody's garage. Doors were still unlocked. There were certain things about the car which suggested that Suzy wasn't driving that car because of the positioning of the seat.
The car was just left in a road, unlocked, no keys. You know, you sort of think she's obviously taken her keys out. Why didn't she lock it? And the police were trying to be as supportive as possible. Didn't know what had happened and how to, you know, respond to it, really.
The car was a worrying factor, and residents in Fulham were also reporting some other alarming news.
Information was coming through that she'd been seen by locals and had some sort of argument with a male outside Shorrold Road.
This raised concerns even further. Police now had a missing young woman, her car abandoned, and reports of a possible altercation with a man. They rushed to try and find any more clues.
The people we needed to interview immediately were her closest friends and work colleagues, and what came from that then escalated to where she associated, her friends, where she drank and ate. She was part of a very close-knit group of friends. I think Diana Lamplugh called them the Putney set. We had to interview all those guys.
There's this window. If you don't do anything within that window, then it gets harder and harder to do.
As more time passed, and with little to go off, the police asked for help.
Superintendent Carter went public very quickly on this case, and the help of the media was massive. The public reaction was huge, and that's what you want. You want the public on board. The public can help you greatly, and there was great public reaction to this.
Officers leading the hunt have renewed their appeal for witnesses.
The police put out appeals for help in finding missing people almost on a daily basis in London. I still get them on my computer at home from the press bureau at the Yard. And they're sold very quickly. It's quite often they're children or sometimes there's someone in distress. But the police normally find them within 24, 48 hours, something like that. This wasn't that sort of case. The police knew by the evening of the first day that she disappeared that there could well be something very seriously wrong. By the beginning of August, the police had had over 700 calls from the public with possible information, and they had 100 calls from people who believed they'd seen Suzy Lamplugh on the day that she disappeared or subsequently. At the same time, it obviously stirred up a certain amount of fear in the public because there were reports that a number of shops in London had sold out of women's alarms because people were concerned about a possible attack on them.
As the media picked up the case and the hunt for Suzy went national, her family tried to search for any answers.
There was no sort of enemies, there were no, major boyfriends who would do this, They had nobody to pin it on.
1986. The Metropolitan Police are calling on the public to help with the disappearance of 25-year-old estate agent Suzy Lamplugh. Last seen leaving her office to show a client around a property. There have been no sightings of her since. Her car has been found abandoned, and residents have reported an argument between a man and a woman. But this is all detectives have to go off.
Why was a car in Stevenage Road? Why? We never know. Was she kidnapped? Nah, there wasn't a struggle, was there? Was she forced into a car? That was never seen to be forced into a car, was there? She went voluntarily to do what? I don't know. Did she go down to a street thinking that she was just going to be with a man to have a quiet chat, and things went wrong from there?
Despite huge public support, each lead that is provided reaches a dead end. To the frustration of everyone affected, they are left only with theories about Suzy's fate.
It did dawn on me about sort of like a month or so in that this is it. There is something. She has disappeared. That someone's done something. Someone's taken her, because there was so much press coverage. We used to have to wash the floor of the shop that we sold fish from, and I would put down the newspaper, and of course you see my sister's picture in the newspaper, and you sort of think, it's just a bit of newspaper, but do I leave it down there, put it up, pick it up, or what do you do? You're wanting to keep your hopes up, and you don't go into mourning. I didn't get this feel of loss, because you want to keep your hopes up, You think, any minute now she'll walk through that door when you were down at Mum's, hi, I just thought I would take a holiday. But it never happened.
For the Lamplugh family, the agony of not knowing what happened to Suzy is channeled into the start of a charity in her name.
Her parents, Paul and Diana, felt very passionately that something positive had to come out of Suzy's disappearance. Diana Lamplugh felt that it couldn't all be negative, what had happened. And so within weeks of Suzy's disappearance, the Lamplughs had set up the first meeting of the Suzy Lamplugh Trust, which was really aimed at helping people to live safer, more confident lives, and to find ways of educating people to take steps to improve their personal safety, but without curtailing their freedoms and liberties.
I was very, very proud. When my mum does something, she throws herself into it. People say, well, you should be grieving, you should be mourning your loss of your daughter, but in you're getting all this glorification. But it wasn't. To her, she saw it as something to achieve, to strive, to try and stop others getting in the same situation as Suze.
She had some very influential figures behind her, and that all helped to keep things ticking along. The problem for the police is, alongside that public interest, is their concern for costing.
From a small room in the family home, Suzy's parents worked tirelessly to spread the important message of personal safety, whilst maintaining the pressure on the authorities to keep up the search for their daughter. But as the months went by, they find nothing.
The inquiry went on until it was tapered down, probably about a year later.
To be fair, the Lamplughs themselves were assiduous in trying to get people interested, especially Diana Lamplugh. But it did begin to tail off. And I think it's 1987, the police began to wind the case down. They had no good leads. They had no body. They appeared to have no good suspect, and they didn't have a motive. So given the demands that were on the police in the 80s, for example, you had an active provisional IRA campaign going on in London, you had a number of high-profile robberies, the police force was not as big as it was, as it is now, in fact. It was quite likely that they would start to pull the plug on the investigation, or rather leave it to sleeping. And when that happens, the press and the media normally begins to back off as well.
Publicly, the inquiry into Suzy's disappearance continued, but behind the investigation, her family tried to come to terms with their loss.
The memorial service we had, I think that at that point I knew she wasn't coming back. Life had to move on. It was really at that point I drew a line and said, no, she's not coming back, and she's been murdered. And it's always difficult to say that.
Over the coming years, the public interest in Suzy never waned, and her family campaigned hard to keep the young estate agent in everyone's consciousness. The charity went from strength to strength, but more than a decade after she vanished, and with no sightings of her since, her parents made a decision.
The Lamplugh family went to the High Court and got a ruling saying that because there was no trace of Suzy for 12 years, rulings made that they are deceased.
This decision to have their daughter officially declared dead coincided with a shock move by the Metropolitan Police.
It really morphed into a homicide investigation, I think after that amount of time, with no trace of her financial profile. No one knew where she was. She didn't come to light in any shape or form. And it was then a homicide investigation. The Cold Case Review looked at Suzy Lamplug's case, and basically what it looked at were forensic advancements in the intervening years.
14 years after Suzy Lamplugh vanished from the streets of Fulham, the Metropolitan Police pushed to solve the mystery once more.
And I was given the task at the end of 1999 to read through the files, and I was appointed the senior investigating officer at that time and commenced a brand new reinvestigation in 2000.
I do appeal to whoever it is, please to let her go.
There was massive media coverage of the Lamplugh case in '86 and the intervening years, and various theories were put forward. We had the normal, what I call mystics, water dividers, amateur criminologists, and even some criminologists coming up with various theories, but it did lack some hard evidence.
Despite this, all the information the police had seemed to point the finger at one man, John Cannan. A name that had caught the attention of officers all those years previously, but now was back in the frame.
There was a massive circumstantial evidence that we uncovered in the reinvestigation that pointed to Cannan. There were a number of other suspects in the case that we eliminated, and we basically exhausted every line of inquiry that we could.
For the first time in 14 years, officers had their sights firmly on one person, John David Guise Cannan, now 46 years old and in prison for other offences.
He'd been convicted of an abduction and the murder of Shirley Banks in Bristol, and the facts were so similar that it needed to be looked at.
29-year-old Shirley Banks disappeared in October 1987 from a car park in Bristol, following a shopping trip. She was never seen again. Her body was discovered in the Quantock Hills in Somerset the following Easter. John Cannan was arrested shortly afterwards.
Coincidentally, he wasn't just arrested for that. He was arrested for a string of other sexual assaults, abductions and rapes, and attempted rapes and attempted abductions. He'd committed a whole series of those offences of which he was convicted around the time of Shirley Banks.
They made links between him and Shirley Banks because in his flat, in a briefcase, was a tax disc from Shirley Banks' car. They found a fingerprint from Shirley Banks in his flat as well, but that came later. So that's how he begins to come into the picture. He's got a modus operandi which looks very similar. He's involved in the disappearance of Shirley Banks, who was snatched off the street. The evening before she disappeared, he tried to snatch another woman. So there's a lot of interest in this. It's the media and the Lamplughs who say, hang on a minute, come on, you know, this could well be interesting.
Although Cannan had a string of convictions, Bristol is over 150 miles from Fulham. What other evidence could connect this known criminal to Suzy Lamplugh?
The Lamplughs later said that they had told the police that they thought Suzy had a boyfriend in the last few weeks before she died, who they believed came from the Bristol area, which is where Cannan's family lived, actually. And subsequently, the other witnesses came forward saying that they believed she had a boyfriend, that he might be from the West Country.
And more disturbing information was to come.
She told one of her relatives shortly before she disappeared that she was very concerned about the guy that she was going out with and she was getting quite scared of him.
"25-year-old estate agent Suzy Lamplugh has not been seen since leaving her office in 1986 to go and meet a client, Mr Kipper. 14 years later, police review the case and specifically turn their attention to one man, John Cannan. In prison for the murder of another woman, Shirley Banks, a year after Suzy's disappearance, officers quickly began to build up more circumstantial evidence, putting him in the frame.
Cannan was interviewed by us twice. You might find this strange. John Cannan was in prison in the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, yet he denies ever having been to Fulham. He knew where Kensington was, knew where Notting Hill was, knew where Hammersmith was, but strangely said he'd never been to Fulham. Incredulous as that might seem, that's what he said, and that's recorded. We could prove that he had. We know he had work experience. He was released on a daily basis. What is significant, he was released from prison the Friday before she went missing. Now, okay, people say, oh, what a coincidence. I don't believe in too many coincidences, not when they all mount up.
And further circumstantial evidence positioned Cannan in the area at the time Suzy disappeared.
We did a reenactment at the time, and we identified some new witnesses, one being a jogger who said he thought that somebody looking like Suzy and Cannan having an argument in the car at about the time. It was significant that we believed the vehicle to be a left-hand drive BMW, either very dark coloured, either black or navy blue, and they drove off at speed. We identified a car that Cannan had been using in crime with a criminal associate who were both in the prison hostel next to Wormwood Scrubs. There's other circumstantial evidence where Cannan turned up at a house in Fulham that was for sale, uninvited, without an estate agent, and the woman let him in, although she felt a bit suspicious. Fortunately, her husband was in the house. He didn't realise that, started behaving strangely, and the husband came into the room and he left quickly. You got the Shorrold Road episode where you got Mr Kipper, and you know that is definitely there. We had a witness that came forward that put Cannan looking in the estate agent's window the day before Suzy went missing.
All this alarming information, pieced together gradually, began to paint a picture of what might have happened to Suzy and who could be responsible for her disappearance. And another mystery. The name in Suzy's diary also pointed to Cannan, after rumours circulated that his nickname in prison was Kipper. As officers honed in, they looked deeper into this violent criminal's background.
He was born in the Midlands, so I think to a middle-class family, went to grammar school. But at the age of 14, he was convicted of a sex attack. He worked as a car salesman and eventually got married and had a child. But he was a very erratic character. He abandoned his wife and child and took up with a girlfriend. And when they fell out, he attacked her quite brutally. He was eventually jailed for 8 years for a series of sex attacks. And what begins to emerge in his makeup is that he is, or was, very attractive to women. He appeared to be very old-fashioned. He would chat up a girl, and then he would perhaps send her a box of chocolates or some flowers, and then he would appear with a bottle of champagne. And he comes over as very smooth, very affable, appears to be a successful businessman, which he certainly wasn't, and he appears to have a rather nice romantic streak, although there's something in the background you won't like, certainly if you're a woman.
But what was it about Cannan that drove him to such violence?
One of the things about John Cannan, he doesn't like rejection. There is a pattern with former girlfriends where when he feels rejected by them, he resorts to violence.
One former girlfriend in particular would provide Jim Dickey and his team with some very specific information.
There was an episode where she made some comments about Cannan. Where they had a conversation in a car near Norton Barracks in West Midlands, where he said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing it, who knows, Suzy could be there.
This is the first time somebody had directly quoted Cannan mentioning Suzy in any way, and needed further investigation.
And that's why Norton Barracks had quite significant meaning in a way, but unfortunately over the intervening probably 15, 16 years, we did a scoping exercise in that area, but it was hugely developed, was completely different from what it was at the time, and the advice we were given at the time was you just wouldn't succeed because you'd have to dig up houses and the foundations, and hugely expensive.
Whether this comment from Cannan was legitimate or a hollow statement, we may never know.
He plays mind games. Cannan does things for a reason, either to throw people off the scent, to impose his Walter Mitty thought process on other people.
Another potential clue that has always kept officers guessing is a registration plate Cannan fitted to Shirley Banks's vehicle, the year after Suzy disappeared.
SLP 386S. You could interpret that as Suzy Lamplugh, 86, year being 86. What the rest of the figures mean, who knows? And the last bit, who knows what that means either. There is also an interpretation that could be a reference on a map, because the reference does correspond or very close to the area of Norton Barracks in Somerset. And it's the sort of thing Cannan would do. He would throw in a sweetener to either draw you off completely or to give you a big clue and see if you were clever enough, almost like a crossword clue.
With all this information pointing to Cannan, officers took the decision to launch a search for Suzy's body. The Metropolitan Police relaunched the investigation into Suzy Lamplug's disappearance after her family took the decision to have her legally declared deceased. And with a fresh look at the case, one man became their prime suspect, John Cannan. After receiving particular information, detectives decided not to search a military base, but turned their attention to a site in Somerset.
There was a search in the Quantocks where Shirley Banks's body had been disposed of. That's hugely significant when you look at Cannan's profiling. The fact that he disposed of Shirley Banks's body in that region, I felt, and other officers agreed with me, that it was worth exploring, because as a child he used to go on holiday in that region, and obviously knew the area quite well. I wouldn't say it's wild, but it's just farmland and forest. We didn't find anything, but it gave us an insight into Cannan's thought process around this.
Although they were no closer to finding Suzy, officers were determined to keep looking.
We did another search subsequent to that, I think about a year later, again in Somerset, in the Somerset Levels, close to one of the rivers. And we searched there because we had some intelligence that Cannan frequented the area and it might be a possible burial site for Suzy. We also employed RAF to overfly of certain regions and take photographs, and were able to analyse those photographs to say what might be good sites to dig because of the impression. We also had the Royal Marines helped us. Hand on heart, I can't say we didn't do things because the obstacles were too high.
Yet despite an enormous amount of collaboration between the services, nothing was found at this location either. Whilst the police were keen to draw some conclusion with the searches, this wasn't important for everyone.
Maybe it was just getting the person who had killed her. That was as far as I'm concerned. I wasn't interested in finding her body. I'd rather leave sleeping dogs lie. Just keep her memory. I'm more interested in the future and trying to save other people from getting the same thing happen to her.
Suzy's body may not have been located, but with the mounting circumstantial evidence, Jim Dickey interviewed the man he felt was responsible.
From memory, Cannan did not come up with an alibi. Now, that might have been deliberate. The thing is, if you give an alibi, you give the police an opportunity to prove or disprove it, which is what we would have done. If you haven't got an alibi, there's nothing to prove or disprove.
With Cannan giving nothing away and no hard evidence categorically pinning the crime to him, the new investigation concluded.
Well, Cannan has never been charged. He's arrested, but he's never been charged. It's all circumstantial, no clear link.
The prosecutor agreed we'd done a very thorough reinvestigation, could not see that there was anything we could do further.
Regardless of this outcome, the police made an unprecedented announcement.
I was quite surprised by the fact the police were so upfront about John Cannan. Normally what happens is if the police do suspect somebody, very strongly suspect somebody is responsible, they may well guide the press by saying privately that they believe this may well be the culprit. But in this instance, in 2002, they were very upfront about it.
I'm happy in my own mind that John Cannan is the man who probably abducted, sexually abused or raped Suzy and murdered her. We said so at a press conference when the results were made, which is unusual in the extreme.
John Cannan has been interviewed twice by police in connection with Suzy's murder since his arrest.
Whilst the new investigation didn't lead to an official conviction, it did bring some possible answers for those close to Suzy. And in the years since she has vanished, the trust set up by her parents continues to grow.
It's been part of my mum and dad's, still my dad's life. He's not so much involved in it now, but he still has a bit of a role. And friends as well. And my brother-in-law and friends of the family are also in trustees as well. So it's nice to see that everyone's sort of involved. My mum gave her rest of her life for it.
There's been a number of achievements over the years. One of the most significant ones has been to really pioneer personal safety for lone workers. We go into workplaces every day of the week training people on how to take steps to improve their personal safety. And we really focus on people who are working on their own and particularly people who are doing things like house visits.
I find it incredibly humbling that the family were able to divert their energies into a cause for good, which to this day still does good work protecting lone people travelling anywhere in the world, really.
We also, over the years, have campaigned for a number of improvements to personal safety from more of a sort of policy point of view. So it was the Trust that really spearheaded the campaign to bring in licensing for minicabs, and the Trust really was the driving force behind the 1998 Act to licence private hire vehicles. Since 2010, we've run the National Stalking Helpline, and this year we celebrated having supported 10,000 victims of stalking in the last 4 years.
Many theories over Suzy's fate have been explored over the years, one of which, stalking, plays a large part.
My informed theory is that Suzy was stalked by John Cannan. He'd probably spoken to her, might even have taken her on a date. Suzy certainly fitted the profile of what John Cannan sought, in as much that she was blonde, attractive, worked as an estate agent, very presentable young lady, came from a good family. Little doubt that Cannan stalked her. Little doubt that Cannan viewed properties with her, that he'd observed her through the window of the estate agents, which probably drew him to go in and seek to view properties. I think that Suzy got into a row with Cannan on the day. He abducted her from the car, or made her get into the vehicle he had at the time. There then ensued probably quite a very heated row, where he basically drove off, abducting her. Where he went from there is a matter of conjecture.
She would have probably just thought him as a normal person, buyer, and just went from there, and probably she was a goner when she just entered the house or the car or whatever. I'm so pleased that the Trust is actually doing a lot more with stalking, because it is something that I think that Suzy probably was stalked.
And whilst the Trust gathers momentum and changes people's lives, the case to find Suzy remains open.
The inquiry's still there. It's not been closed, and it never will be closed until probably Suzy's body's found and Cannan's either convicted or he's eliminated.
In 2010, officials decided to revisit Norton Barracks after some fresh information, in the hope a conclusion would finally be met. But this search drew a blank. Officials are hopeful that the technology available today could help solve the mystery, many of which were not around in the 1980s.
The lack of technology then, for example, CCTV cameras, mobile phone, cell analysis, tracing, the computer system of homes, forensic ability of DNA, all that today is available, not necessarily back in 1986. Well, we didn't have cell site analysis and CCTV in them days. If we'd have had CCTV in itself, the inquiry would have been far in advance.
John Cannan remains the #1 suspect for abducting and murdering Suzy Lamplugh. He continues to deny his involvement, but has made cryptic remarks in the past.
He said to the solicitor in a throwaway remark, I may well tell all when my mother dies. The fact that we had the comment means probably it was made or overheard. Whether Cannan supports that or not, who knows? I have come across people like Cannan, who I believe is a psychopath, clear and simple. There is a difference between psychopaths and what I call career criminals. Strangely enough, Cannan falls in both those categories. A, because he's abducted, serial sex offender and murdered female victims. Also, he's had a career in criminality involving armed robbery, credit card fraud, cheque fraud, petty crime, which strangely enough he'll admit to, but when it comes to the serial sex offending, abductions, kidnaps, murders, he's in complete denial. He's got a full life tariff, which means that he has to serve until he's 65 or longer before he's considered for parole. And my view is, if he ever was released, he would still be a danger to the female population of this country.
I haven't really grieved Suze in a way. We've had memorials, and you know, I always remember turning around at the memorial service and thinking, oh, Suze might walk down the aisle. And of course, she never did. And yeah, so grieving is the wrong word. It's mourning her loss, I suppose. It's in terms of she's not there, but we have no body, we have no grave, we have nothing to tangibly fix on.
I do think that it's quite possible that at some time in the future that Suzy Lamplug's body will be found. Somebody walking a dog, the dog might find something in undergrowth, which is a body. There are forensic tests which can now be carried out. There are lots of work that can be done on identifying bodies, and it may well be that she does turn up.
I think that so many people looked at her and thought, well, that could be me, that could be my daughter. She was just someone who I think was very, very easy for people to relate to. And it was such a shocking thing that happened to her. I also think that Diana Lamplugh was an incredibly powerful voice at the time of Suzy's disappearance, and indeed afterwards. And I think, you know, it's very much down to Diana's passion and ability to really get her message across that the Suzy Lamplugh Trust is still around today.
I don't know what it is, and I can't put my finger on it. There's something about the Suzy Lamplugh inquiry that all of us wanted to get there sooner rather than later. And it's unfortunately, even today, we haven't found her. And I hope to God that one day we do.
I don't think of her often as such. Obviously, we have her birthday, and we always, we used to do lots of absent friends when we had a get-together. She was a very bubbly and very happy. I am not one for dwelling on her. Nice memories.
Somebody who's easy and relaxed to be with.
A smartly dressed businessman outlines his ideal partner in a dating agency video.
I'm a little bit dry as regards humour.
But behind the jokey, relaxed charm lurks a monster, rapist and murderer John Cannan.
If you look at the ability for this man to sit in front of a camera and be plausible, to actually be nice, to present himself as an okay character that wouldn't hurt a fly, you're beginning to understand something about this man who can take a woman, who can brutalise her, who can rape her, who can violate her and kill her. And immediately after he has done that, revert back again to what I call the okay world. He's a man who functions like a chameleon. He's a fantasist.
If you could choose to live in any period of history, which would you choose?
Elizabethan. I think a ruff would suit me.
Right.
Tights and a sword. I can see me on some bridge or some galleon, being a pirate. Yes, I can handle that.
Away from his make-believe world, John Cannan lived with a dark secret. How estate agent Suzy Lamplugh disappeared. Now, after a 2-year investigation, which has unearthed new evidence, detectives are convinced Cannan holds the key to one of Britain's biggest and most baffling murder mysteries. Detectives have never given up hope of finding Suzy's body. Searching over years large areas of the Quantock Hills near Taunton in Somerset, and in Worcestershire, just off the M5, a former army barracks, now a housing estate. "25-year-old Suzy disappeared on July the 28th, 1986, when she went to show a house for sale in Shorrold Road, Fulham, West London, to a strangely named client, Mr Kipper.
Well, she was a young, ambitious, eloquent and very good-looking lady who was making her way in the business world. It could have happened to any successful young woman pursuing her career to meet the wrong person at the wrong time, making perhaps one wrong decision.
She's enormously charismatic, and she had sort of an air about her that you know, when she came into, she's one of these people, when she came into the room, you noticed that she was there, it's nice to remember her like that, and remember her as she really was.
Suzy was an extremely attractive young lady. I would coin the phrase a head-turner. If she walked down the road, most young men would look at her.
The enigma of Suzy was the speed with which she disappeared and just the nature of that disappearance.
It's taken Scotland Yard 16 years and 4 investigations to unravel that enigma, and they believe finally produce the evidence that proves Cannan responsible for Suzy's abduction and murder.
All the evidence that we gathered all seemed to point in one direction. John Cannan is our main suspect, and the more we looked at him, the more apparent it was that the evidence against him was strengthened as opposed to leading to eliminate him.
I was probably the most negative for the first 18 months in terms of accepting he was the main suspect. I was very open-minded in terms of still pursuing lots of other lines of inquiry. However, the more I dealt with information or evidence that appertained to John Cannan, the more I became happy in my own mind that he was the man I should be interviewing about the abduction and murder of Suzy Lamplugh.
3 days before Suzy went missing, John Cannan was formally released from prison after serving 5 years of an 8-year sentence for an horrific and brutal rape and other offences.
We know from his victims that John Cannan could not stand rejection by a woman.
It is possible that he thought Suzy was a woman who could respond to his charms. I bet you at times he believed he was God's gift to women. I bet he believed that he could turn social intercourse into sexual intercourse very quickly. However, Suzy was a person who was maybe very different in her characteristics of how she would deal with a man like him. She may not have complied, she may have pushed him away, she may have rejected him, she may have put him down. The problem is with putting a man like him down is that there's danger.
We knew that Suzy wouldn't have gone off on her own. And so if she hadn't gone off on her own, she must have been taken against her will. And I'm not too sure, while Suzy was extraordinary in lots of ways, I'm not too sure that she could have survived as a prisoner. And I think that we came to the conclusion, fairly early in our own minds actually, that she wasn't going to come back. She was dead.
Born in 1954 into the middle-class world of former RAF Flight Lieutenant Shorrold Cannan and his wife Sheila, John Cannan was the eldest of their 3 children. The family lived in a smart Sutton Coldfield suburb. Idolised by his mother, Cannan had a fractious relationship with his overbearing father. Bright and good at sport, Cannan left school with few qualifications, following his father into the motor trade after a short spell in the Merchant Navy. At 24, he married long-standing girlfriend June Vale. The marriage was soon in difficulties, as Cannan, police believe, began leading a double life as a serial rapist. Targeting homes for sale, more than 20 women over a 2-year period were assaulted across the West Midlands. 3 were violently raped. Detectives say the attacks bore all the hallmarks of Cannan's later methods.
For the past 2 years, throughout the Midlands, police have been hunting a man who's become known as the house for sale rapist, who preys on women alone in properties being advertised for sale.
No one has ever been arrested, and Cannan has never been questioned. The rape stopped in early 1980, at the same time that Cannan embarked on a passionate affair with an attractive 32-year-old brunette, Sharon Majors.
John was handsome and charming and great fun to be with, but it wasn't long before I began to be able to pick holes in the tales he was telling me. Eventually I ended the relationship after he became very jealous because I told him I was spending Christmas Day with my children and ex-husband. He came round full of charm and carrying a bottle of champagne. Instead of a romantic evening, it turned into a nightmare. He pulled a gun and threatened me. I tried to escape, but he grabbed me and we fell downstairs. I think I was knocked out. I was badly injured and taken to hospital. The police were called, but they just put it down as a domestic row.
John has many motives to his behaviour. Although his penis is a weapon for him, so is his psychological makeup in the way he controls, in the way he expresses power, in the way he's able to express a plausibility and be able to con women into getting them to believe that he's somebody that he's not, who's able to have a secret world, who is able to create something around himself which actually is a myth. And yet when he loses control, and that is something he often will do, he reacts violently, he reacts aggressively, and he wants to somehow stop the feeling that he has that he's being taken over. So he has to take control, and tragically it is women who are on the receiving end of it.
Early in 1981, Cannan was living in a Birmingham bedsit. Drinking heavily and short of money, he turned to armed robbery. His first raid was on a petrol station just a few yards from where he lived.
Money out the till. Get the money out now. Don't move. Come on, come on.
He escaped with just £260. Out of work, alone, depressed and resentful, the sinister side of Cannan's nature emerged. He walked into a West Midlands knitwear shop and at knife point brutally raped a 37-year-old pregnant woman, Jean Bradford, in front of her mother and child.
I was in the back office as this man walked round the shop holding a handkerchief over his mouth as if he had a cold. When I approached him, he pulled out a knife and walked into the back office, warning me he'd cut me up unless I kept quiet. He emptied the cash box and rifled through my purse. My mother came in, not knowing what was happening. He forced her to face the wall as well. He got very nervous and refused to let us go.
Hands behind your back. Just don't move.
Then he tied my mother up. He turned his attention back to me and began to fiddle with my dress. He said he'd hurt the baby if I didn't do as I was told. Then he made me take off all my clothes and rape me. even though we told him I was pregnant.
And he's incredibly abusive to women sexually when he's raping them. The violation of rape is bad enough, but he goes further. Some of his violence and sexual aggression towards these women went way beyond what we know some rapists do.
A week later, Cannan was arrested after an artist's impression of the attacker appeared in local papers. In a bid to avoid detection, he'd shaved off the middle of his distinctive bushy eyebrows. 3 months later, aged 27, he was jailed for a total of 8 years at Birmingham Crown Court after pleading guilty to rape and robbery. As a convicted sex offender, Cannan's early months in prison were difficult. He was regularly attacked and put into isolation and segregation. He had 2 regular visitors, his mother and Annabel Rose, a Bristol lawyer he'd asked to help him gain access to his young daughter. After serving almost 5 years, Cannan was transferred in January 1986 to a pre-release hostel attached to Wormwood Scrubs prison in West London, 6 months before the end of his sentence. During the day, he worked at a local theatrical prop supplier. Not having to return to the hostel until late evening, Cannan was soon back to his old ways, bragging to workmates of his success with women he'd met in local wine bars. He claimed he was dating an uptown girl called Susu. One of his haunts was this pub, the Prince of Wales in Putney.
He just said that it was a lively pub and it was like a pub or wine bar. I used to go there quite regular.
He had been inside a long time and he had missed one of the most essential ingredients in his social life, that was women. So I think John Cannan at that stage went out looking for women.
He had these film stars look, these beautiful blue eyes, the dark hair, the charming smile. He could have had anyone. He didn't need to do what he did because he had the world in his hands and he could have had any woman that he wanted. He was a monster. But he didn't look like a monster.
He had a way of looking at women that in certain circumstances could make them feel extremely special, and they put that down to a quality of which they associated with his eyes. And although one of these ladies afterwards said that she'd in fact be haunted by the memory of his eyes when she learned the truth about him and the sort of man he was.
He was in a hostel attached to the Scrubs, which allowed him to go to work on a daily basis. He was allowed to go home to the Birmingham area at weekends. We'd done a large number of inquiries in and around the other inmates at the time. We've done made inquiries into where Mr Cannan may or may not have gone when he had home leave. And again, we've spoken to people who employed him and work colleagues. John Cannan had access to a Red Sierra whilst he was in the Scrubs hostel. It was a vehicle that he had borrowed from another inmate.
He regularly used the car to go to the Bournemouth area. One trip during the Maybank holiday weekend of 1986 coincided with the disappearance of Sandra Court, a 27-year-old insurance clerk, after she left Steps nightclub. She was last seen shortly before 3 a.m. on Saturday, barefoot, yards from her home. Sandra's body was found at 7 p.m. in a water-filled ditch near Herne. She'd been strangled. Although no one has been charged with her murder, Cannan has been interviewed by detectives but denies any involvement.
John Cannan would have had access to that vehicle at the same time that Sandra Court was murdered.
16 years later, Scotland Yard traced the car to a North London scrapyard, subjecting it to microscopic scientific examination. They discovered 2 human hairs, one in the footwell, the other on the headrest. DNA testing revealed a possibility the hairs belonged to Sandra Court.
The DNA found in the Red Sierra probably would have assisted the Sandra Court inquiry more than it assisted ours. The DNA found is about 40,000 to 1, which isn't sufficient to put before a court.
Cannan was finally released from prison on Friday, July the 25th, 1986. That night, estate agent Suzy Lamplugh and her boyfriend had a drink in the Prince of Wales, the pub frequented by Cannan. While in the pub, the contents of Suzy's handbag went missing. Police believe Cannan was responsible.
It was a Friday night, it was the end of the week, so we were out celebrating, met her at her flat, and then we went round the corner to a local restaurant for dinner, had a very nice evening, just usual stuff of what had gone on in the week, what we were doing for the weekend, and then went for a drink in the pub next door, and we think that it was in there that somebody took something from her bag, a checkbook, a diary, some cards, and a couple of other things, so that was a bad end to a good evening.
There was a mystery caller rang her estate agent stating that they'd found the checkbook, and a policeman had rung up and reported this, that, well, that person wasn't a police officer. It has all the hallmarks of a stalker, in my view.
We had a seemingly normal evening, just two young people out and having a nice night out, and it's quite an eerie thought that somebody may have been there watching every movement.
Hello, this is Suzy Lamplugh from Sturgis in Fulham. Did you receive our details that we sent through to you? Oh, good. Did you see it?
The following Monday, Suzy was at her desk at Sturgis Estate Agents in Fulham as usual. She was due to show a 3-bedroomed terrace house in nearby Shorrold Road to a potential client, the mysteriously named Mr Kipper.
We have a young, attractive, professional girl who is an estate agent. She works in a shop in Fulham Road. She's well known by local people because she has a desk at the front of the office. She leaves the office about 12:30 for an appointment, written in her diary, 12:45, Mr Kipper, Shorrold Road. It's lunchtime, children are off school, there's lots of people about. There's a market there, that's full of people. She gets in a car, she drives to Shorrold Road. She double parks the car. She's seen by the man next door, who's sitting in his front window. He sees a girl, fair girl, light-haired, and a man come up to her. Good description of a man, 5'8", smartly dressed, shirt and tie, carrying a bottle of champagne.
Mr Kipper was the only appointment that we couldn't trace. All the ones the previous weeks we spoke to, and she was there at 12:15, 1 o'clock, 1:30, 2 o'clock. She met her clients on the dot. And so all her lunchtime appointments, in our view, were absolutely, totally bona fide.
One of the last sightings of Suzy was when her car was seen being driven erratically near Shorrold Road. A van driver, forced to swerve, said the woman driver was rowing with a male passenger.
The next thing we've got is round the corner, Stevenage Road, we find her car, unlocked, not dangerously parked, but parked near the entrance to a garage, nearly covering a garage, which is why a woman opposite notices it. She says, that car's parked by this garage, and my friend's husband want to get into his garage. So there's things like that that we knew at a very early time, and the evidence we had at that very start was more or less the evidence we had throughout the inquiry. We never really developed it much beyond that.
Diana phoned me at the office to say that she'd been phoned by Suzy's boss to ask whether Diana had seen her, and that Diana was sort of worried that this was unusual for Suzy not to have come back to the office after lunch. And I think we both had a sort of a shiver of a feeling about it.
Could she have met a lover and run off? And that was obviously one major line of inquiry. Did she just want to disappear? But that was soon eliminated because, having spoke to her friends and her colleagues, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. Basically, we've got a girl going about her normal business in the middle of London in July, virtually disappearing. Absolutely astonishing.
As if someone had come down in a spaceship and moved a car at the same time. And to this day, as far as I'm aware, there's not much more evidence than that about what actually happened at the time, despite a massive media campaign publicising the case, publicising the facts, appealing for witnesses from all over the land, and nothing. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the biggest case, as far as publicity had, that the Metropolitan Police has ever dealt with.
This enormous publicity then gave me millions of prospective detectives, and I expected good information. The response was absolutely outstanding, but unfortunately the information coming in wasn't really any help to us whatsoever.
One hadn't got any evidence one way or the other, so one had a hope. When that faded, I really can't remember. But of course we got to the point when the police began to believe that she'd been murdered, and I suppose we began to talk and accept the fact that she had. But she wasn't here, and we knew she wasn't coming back. And there was no other answer but that she had been murdered.
Although he has always denied abducting and killing Suzy Lamplugh, John Cannan fled to Bristol within days of her disappearance. He continued preying on women, financing his sinister obsession through armed robberies.
Like many other big cities in the mid to late 80s, I think Bristol had a wine bar culture, and I think John Cannan saw wine bars as a stalking ground, a hunting ground, and I think he targeted the Avon Gorge Hotel wine bar, which was less than half a mile from where he was living, as a prime site.
I became aware of John Cannan of visiting the hotel on a regular basis at the end of '86, and this was generally on a Friday or a Saturday evening, and he would come fairly regularly, at least once a month. He would book into the hotel, he would be friendly with the reception staff, probably slightly too friendly. He did like a certain suite which is located on the second floor. It's called the Princess Suite, and if this suite wasn't available, then he wouldn't stay in the hotel. It had a jacuzzi bathroom, small lounge area, and also the double bed in the room. It wasn't just a normal double bed, it was a king-size bed. The room retailed normally at about £90 in those days, which was a lot of money to stay a stone's throw away from your own home. So he always paid for his room by cash. I never once saw a checkbook, never once saw a credit card. He liked his little treats, as I would say, flowers in the bedroom, which he always brought a vase for. He also liked his own champagne, and occasionally we would see him bring in his own champagne in, which was part of his image to entice the ladies to go up, to feel comfortable with him on neutral territory.
One of the many women who fell for his smooth-talking charm at the Avon Gorge Hotel was former ice skater Gilly Page.
I was working on a cigarette promotion in Bristol between appearing in ice shows. I was having dinner in the restaurant with the other promotion girls. I was bored with the conversation. A good-looking businessman, dining alone, kept looking at me and smiling. I suppose I was flattered by his attention. After dinner, I bumped into him in reception. He handed me a bottle of champagne with a note saying he'd fallen in love with me. The note also had his room number on it. I suppose I was impressed by this rather romantic approach. I agreed to meet him later, and we sat on the balcony drinking champers and chatting for a couple of hours. It was was really charming and courteous and very relaxed and good company. I told him I came from the Midlands and he said he did as well. He offered to drive me home when the promotion finished.
2 days later, Cannan drove Gilly home along the M5. At Norton in Worcestershire, he turned off the motorway and into the grounds of a then disused army camp, parking in a deserted spot. It was then that Cannan came out with a startling statement.
He suddenly said, "This is the sort of place where Suzy Lamplugh could be buried." Then he put his hands around my throat saying, "And this is how she could have died." It was really scary. Eventually, he laughed and drove me home.
I think when John Cannan dated and certainly went on the journey from the West Country up to Birmingham with Gilly Page, that from what I know about the build-up to that, yes, she could have been another victim. Great effort was made by John Cannan when he was meeting Gilly Page in certain situations, namely booking hotels, the payment for those hotels. He would insist that no one knew where she was going in terms of her family. Fortunately, she took the precaution each time of either using her proper name to book or pay for hotels and certainly letting her parents know where she was.
Their last meeting, just before Gilly went to work abroad, was in Poole in Dorset.
He told me to book into this hotel as his wife using a false name. When he discovered that I'd not followed his strict instructions, he hit the roof and went wild. I was frightened, and later, when I realised what he was like and what could have happened to me, I had a nervous breakdown.
A confident womanizer, Cannan successfully juggled affairs with several women at once. One of those he two-timed was Bristol solicitor Annabel Rose, who'd earlier given him ad hoc advice in prison.
I think with some of the women who had affairs with him, for example, the solicitor who was representing him, there's an incredibly mixed logic. He would have been fascinating, he would have been exciting, he would have been dangerous. I mean, when you consider that a woman who knows that he's a serial rapist is still able to engage in a sexual affair with him on his release from prison, you begin to understand the type of man that John Cannan is.
Early in the Annabel affair, an attempt was made to abduct a woman in broad daylight. In White Ladies Road, a man resembling Cannan tried and failed to force a woman into a car. Half an hour later, Cannan was calmly withdrawing money from a cash machine in the same road. Within 12 hours, Cannan struck again, this time in Reading, abducting and raping a young woman, Donna Tucker, he found sitting alone in her parked car.
I had a blazing row with my husband and left the house to cool down and drove to a quiet street a couple of miles away.
Do you know where Balfour Drive is?
I'm sorry, that was
Oh. Have you got an A to Z? Get in the back, I've got a knife. Come on, get in the back. Just get down.
He drove us to an industrial estate. I was terrified, but I believed that by being submissive, I had a chance of staying alive. He got in the back and raped me.
After the attack, Cannan nonchalantly strolled away, flagging down a passing taxi. Five weeks later, he was arrested, but Donna, severely traumatized, failed to pick him out in an identity parade. Later, he would be convicted of her abduction and rape. Cannan's relationship with Annabel Rose lasted almost a year before turning sour. Feeling bitter and rejected, he made malicious allegations to the police and the Law Society against her.
The trouble is that as soon as they want to break out of that fantasy for whatever reason, they hit something in him that is incredibly basic, They hit something about rejection, about betrayal. They hit some anger within him that needs him to get control and take control and express that control in a whole variety of abusive ways.
Cannan now decided on a new and novel way of approaching unsuspecting women, joining a dating agency. He paid the £95 joining fee to agency boss Caroline Francis.
He was actually very nice. I thought he was attractive, well presented. He had a smart suit on, and he came across as a very confident and probably fairly aggressive person. But I did actually quite like him.
Prince Charles, he was socially aware.
He's in control. He feels that he is plausible, that he can get other people to believe in what he's actually saying. It's hard to believe that he's a person who has raped and who has killed, and here he is sitting, in a sense, in a play.
I'm in a sedimentary period
Yeah.
where financially and career-wise I've achieved what I've wanted to achieve.
Yeah.
I'm just now looking for what the next thing to achieve. So I'm reasonably open. It could be another business, but equally it could be something entirely different.
Right.
I think I told you that within a few weeks I shall be going to the Himalayas.
Uneasy with Cannan's performance, the agency decided not to release the video.
Which for me would be my first major adventurous trip.
Do you think there was any suggestion that you were going to be one of his victims?
I think now, looking back with hindsight, it's probably very likely that I would have been. It's lucky that my husband was in the office and that I wasn't actually there alone, because I think if I'd been there alone with him, things might have been very different.
2 days after making the video, Cannan attacked again. Armed with a gun, he attempted another abduction in Bristol.
Do as you're told and you won't get hurt.
No!
Cannan was fought off. Later, his would-be victim positively identified him. Next day, October the 8th, 1987, 29-year-old newly married Shirley Banks was preparing to meet her husband Richard to go out for dinner. An accounts manager with a local firm, Shirley was last seen late night shopping in Debenham's department store in Bristol city centre. She never made the dinner date.
I went through every possible eventuality in my own mind and contacted every single person, and obviously one hopes that at any moment in time good news or the explanation will arrive, but unfortunately it didn't.
Next morning, Shirley failed to turn up for work. At 9 a.m, a colleague received a call from Shirley saying she was ill. Shirley was never heard from again. Her disappearance was as sudden and mystifying as Suzy Lamplug's a year earlier. But police at that stage didn't connect the two missing women. 3 weeks later, Cannan, down to his last £6, tried to rob this lady's clothes shop in Leamington Spa, but was frightened off. After a chase, Cannan was caught hiding in the toilets of a local car showroom. When his car was searched, police discovered the tax disc from Shirley Banks' Mini in the glove compartment, together with a replica gun.
I became aware that Foy House, the block of flats where I was living, had become the centre of a murder inquiry late on a Friday afternoon in October. I returned home as darkness was falling to find the area taped off and a large number of uniformed police officers present. It then quickly emerged that the hunt for Shirley Banks, who'd been missing for some weeks, had taken a dramatic turn, because in the garage next to mine was her car. It then emerged that it had been put there, in all probability, by a neighbour who lived at the other end of the block of flats. A man I subsequently learned was called John Cannan. Searches were made of his flat, and inside his flat a discovery was made which solved the case effectively. The police found a document, and on this document was Shirley Banks's thumbprint. So it was put John Cannan during what must have been an incredibly dramatic exchange, that only he and Shirley Banks knew the truth about what had happened to her, and that while Shirley wasn't there to tell them directly, she had done the next best thing. She had left behind her a vital piece of evidence. He was asked if she'd ever visited his flat. He denied it. He was asked again if he was sure she'd never visited his flat. He was adamant she never had. He was then told that her fingerprint had been discovered on a document inside his flat. And before he had any chance to prevaricate or gather his thoughts, he was charged with murder.
6 months later, on Easter Sunday 1988, while Cannan was on remand charged with Shirley's murder, her remains were found in the Quantock Hills by a couple walking their dog. Shirley was identified by 5 pieces of jewellery.
John Cannan was summed up by the judge at his trial as an evil, violent, and vile man. The judge ordered that he should never be again at liberty beyond the prison walls.
At Exeter Crown Court in April 1989, Cannan was given 3 life sentences for murder, rape and abduction. As he was driven away, detectives investigating Suzy Lamplug's disappearance were making arrangements to talk to him. During one interview, Cannan made an uncharacteristic slip.
He said that Shirley Banks was killed by a Bristol businessman. So I asked the question of him, saying, well, do you know who that is? And he said something along the lines of, well, I've met him. The conversation went on about Shirley Banks and Suzy Lamplugh and this Bristol businessman.
She talked about having met somebody who wanted her to go into business with her in some way, or her to go into business with him, and she was obviously worried about it.
In my mind, I was thinking, John, you are that Bristol businessman. And it came to a point where he was talking about Shirley Banks and the Bristol businessman. And I said to him, do you understand that, or is it your belief that Suzy Lamplugh was killed by this Bristol businessman? And he said, yes. And I said, is that you, John? And he said, yes. And then he went, no, and he retracted it straight away.
Whether it was a slip of the tongue, I don't know. John Cannan is a very careful and intelligent man in composing what he wants to say to you. He was careful to manipulate his part of those interviews, very careful. So I doubt that it was a slip, but we know from other sources that statements taken many years ago that he said a very similar thing to a certain person following a magistrate's court hearing back at Shirley Banks' time. Now, I can't really go into detail of that, but certainly from the account of the lady concerned, it would appear that he was putting himself as responsible for not only Shirley Banks' murder, but of Suzy Lamplug's murder.
Detectives reopened the disappearance of Suzy Lamplugh in 2000 as part of a policy of reviewing serious unsolved cases. It was launched with a high-profile press conference and backed by Suzy's parents.
As a mother, I feel, perhaps much more than everybody else, that I very, very much want to know what happened to her, how I could have helped her, how in a way I could almost hold her hand and feel the pain. We never forget the day she disappeared. It is always a difficult day. We try to get right away from other people. We really hope that this case might have an end and that Suzy might be able to be set free. At the moment, it seems as though she's trapped.
Paul and Diana Lamplugh hoped the latest investigation would end their long struggle for justice.
Suzy Lamplugh Trust, can I help you?
A struggle kept in the public eye through the Suzy Lamplugh Trust. a charity devoted to educating women how to protect themselves. After 2 years reassessing evidence, tracing new witnesses and using cutting-edge science, detectives are convinced 48-year-old Cannan has the answers which could bring closure for the Lamplugh family.
Many people think John Cannan looks like the photo fit that was done of the Mr Kipper lookalike in Shorrold Road. So yes, he's not dissimilar to the photo fit. I think he's lied to the police in the past about where he was on that day. If you look at Mr Cannan's offending profile and the victimology of young ladies that he's been convicted of raping, abducting and murdering, I ask you to draw your own conclusion. Some new witnesses have some very interesting things to say, and some of the evidence has been quite crucial.
Particularly that of a jogger who at the time Suzy disappeared ran out of Bishop's Park into Stevenage Road.
I came out of the park to be met by a BMW which tore across the road, come to a halt with somebody with their hand on the hooter, pressing it for a very long time. As I stood there, I saw a blonde young lady. She looked as though she was laughing, or she could have been screaming, because the laugh could have been shouting for help, and it was quite possible that she could have been screaming and not laughing. What worried me, you know, how could you drive with what was going on? It never occurred to me that it was a left-hand drive car.
Another important new piece of evidence came from a woman who saw a man answering Cannan's description looking into Sturgis's window the day before Suzy disappeared.
There's a number of interesting witnesses have come forward who've provided evidence that a mystery man bought a bottle of champagne in the Fulham area, that she'd been sent a large quantity of flowers to a home address.
The flowers that were received at her flat, we know, and he's admitted that that is one of his techniques for initial approaches to women, as is the bottle of champagne. Now we've got sightings of Mr Kipper in Shorrold Road with a bottle of champagne. John Cannan has maintained throughout his previous Metropolitan Police interviews and the two that I conducted with him that he has never met Suzy Lamplugh. I don't believe him. The wealth of material that I had obtained prior to those interviews, I knew that I could, if he'd have exchanged with me in terms of direct questions and answers, I could have demonstrated in that interview that he had lied to the original Metropolitan Police team and clearly would have to concede meeting and knowing Suzy Lamplugh. I was fairly confident that if John Cannan had exchanged with me and answered questions, that clearly I was in a very good position to identify and challenge lies, and I think he'd find it very, very difficult to have told a truthful version without basically confessing to the crime.
But in spite of finding new evidence and new witnesses, Crown prosecution lawyers believe it is not quite strong enough to convict John Cannan.
I feel the evidence against John Cannan is powerful, detailed, quite complex, and unfortunately very circumstantial. We've never found Suzy's body, and I feel if we did, that would give us other evidential opportunities, other forensic opportunities, and open up new lines of inquiry. This investigation is not yet over. All the Crown prosecution are able to say, there may be insufficient evidence to sustain a prosecution at this time. And the important phrase is, at this time.
To have this particular man, who we believe murdered our daughter, convicted of the killing, is to us enormously important. I mean, it's the end that we've been seeking for the last 16 years. It's enormously important that the murderer of our daughter should be kept in prison where he is. And never let out to harm anybody else.
Anyone with information about the disappearance of Suzy Lamplugh can ring Scotland Yard now on 0207 321 9251.